The autumn of 1883 descended upon the foothills of Transylvania with the particular melancholy that marked the seasons in regions where ancient forests pressed against scattered settlements like patient predators waiting for human vigilance to falter, and where the boundary between Christian civilization and older, unnamed forces remained as fragile as morning mist that could dissipate without warning to reveal landscapes that seemed to operate according to principles that predated both Habsburg authority and Orthodox doctrine. The Hoia Baciu forest, sprawling across the ridges west of Cluj in a tapestry of oak, beech and pine that had witnessed the rise and fall of Roman legions, Magyar migrations, and countless local tragedies that lived on only in whispered folklore, presented itself to the approaching hunting party as both opportunity and challenge. Its reputation for providing excellent game, balanced by stories that had accumulated like fallen leaves across generations of local residents who knew better than to venture too deeply into its shadows after sunset. The 27 trappers who had assembled in Cluj during the final days of October represented a cross-section of the skilled hunters and woodsmen who made their livings in the mountainous regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Their expertise with rifle, snare, and tracking techniques having been refined through years of pursuing prey across terrain that could claim the lives of inexperienced men who underestimated the dangers posed by both wild animals and environmental conditions that could change from favorable to deadly within the space of hours. Their leader, Gheorghe Moldovan, possessed a reputation that extended throughout the Carpathian region for his ability to locate game in areas where other hunters found only empty forest. While his knowledge of traditional hunting methods that had been passed down through generations of Romanian peasants provided him with insights into animal behavior that complemented the more modern techniques that had been introduced by German and Austrian settlers, whose scientific approaches to wildlife management had begun to influence hunting practices throughout the region. The decision to establish their base camp within the notorious clearing that marked the heart of the Hoia Baciu forest reflected both practical considerations related to game management and a deliberate challenge to the superstitions that had kept local hunters away from what was widely acknowledged to be some of the richest hunting territory in Transylvania. The clearing itself, a perfectly circular expanse of bare earth that measured approximately 50 meters in diameter, defied every principle of forest ecology that the trappers understood, its sterile soil refusing to support the vegetation that thrived only meters away from its boundaries. While its geometric precision suggested human intervention, despite the absence of any historical records documenting construction activities or agricultural use that might have explained its unusual characteristics. Local folklore attributed the clearing's existence to various supernatural causes that reflected the complex religious and cultural traditions that had shaped Transylvanian peasant beliefs across centuries of occupation by different empires and exposure to influences that ranged from Catholic missionary activity to Islamic expansion, pagan survivals, and the mystical traditions that had emerged from the synthesis of these various spiritual systems. Some villagers claimed that the clearing marked the location where ancient Dacian priests had conducted sacrificial rituals that had rendered the earth permanently sterile, while others insisted that it represented a gateway to underground realms where malevolent spirits gathered to plan mischief against the living world above. But the trappers who approached this enigmatic location during the first week of November 1883 were practical men whose livelihoods depended on their ability to assess environmental conditions according to criteria related to game availability, weather patterns, and terrain features that would affect their success in securing the pelts and meat that would provide their families with resources necessary for surviving the approaching winter. Their initial evaluation of the clearing emphasized its advantages as a campsite. level ground that would facilitate the construction of temporary shelters, central location that would provide access to multiple hunting areas, and clear sight lines that would enable early detection of approaching weather systems or other potential threats that might require rapid response or evacuation. The process of establishing camp within the clearing proceeded according to the systematic methods that experienced hunters employed when setting up base operations in unfamiliar territory, with careful attention to positioning tents and equipment in configurations that would provide both comfort and security, while also maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid deployment of hunting parties toward different areas of the forest, where game sign indicated promising opportunities for successful pursuit. The central fire pit was positioned to take advantage of prevailing wind patterns that would carry smoke away from sleeping areas, while also providing illumination that would deter nocturnal predators whose presence might threaten both human safety and the security of supplies and equipment that represented substantial investments for men whose annual incomes depended on successful hunting seasons. The tents themselves were arranged in a defensive pattern that reflected military influences that many of the trappers had acquired through service in the Austro-Hungarian army, their positioning designed to provide mutual support and overlapping fields of observation, while also creating internal spaces where activities related to equipment maintenance, food preparation, and social interaction could be conducted without unnecessary exposure to weather conditions or potential threats from wildlife that might be attracted to the camp by cooking odors or other indications of human presence. But even during the initial hours of camp establishment, several of the trappers began to notice environmental anomalies that seemed inconsistent with normal forest conditions, and which created a sense of unease that they found difficult to articulate in terms of specific threats or identifiable dangers. The acoustic properties of the clearing seemed to dampen normal forest sounds, while amplifying others in ways that created confusion about distances and directions, making it difficult to maintain accurate awareness of conditions in the surrounding woodland that could affect both safety and hunting success. More disturbing was the behavior of their horses, experienced pack animals whose familiarity with forest environments should have made them reliable indicators of environmental conditions and potential dangers that might not be immediately apparent to human observers. The animals displayed persistent nervousness that manifested itself in constant alertness, reluctance to graze despite the availability of suitable forage, and a tendency to cluster together in the areas of the clearing that were most distant from the forest edge, as if they sensed threats emanating from the tree line that surrounded their temporary home. The magnetic anomalies that affected their compasses provided additional evidence that the clearing possessed unusual characteristics that might have natural rather than supernatural explanations, but which nonetheless created practical problems for navigation and route finding that could prove dangerous if hunting parties became disoriented during expeditions into unfamiliar areas of the forest. The compass needles showed consistent deviation from true north that varied according to position within the clearing, suggesting the presence of mineral deposits or geological formations that were affecting the instrument's accuracy in ways that required constant adjustment and verification against celestial navigation techniques that were more reliable but also more time-consuming to employ. The first evening in camp provided the trappers with their initial direct experience of the phenomena that had contributed to the clearing's sinister reputation among local villagers, who had learned through generations of bitter experience to avoid areas where normal natural laws seemed to operate according to modified principles that could prove fatal to individuals who failed to recognize and adapt to altered conditions. The campfire that had been built according to standard procedures using dry wood that should have burned with normal flame characteristics instead produced flames that exhibited unusual coloration and temperature properties that seemed to violate basic principles of combustion, while also creating atmospheric effects that influenced both visibility and psychological comfort in ways that the trappers found deeply unsettling. The blue tinge that characterized the flame coloration could not be attributed to the presence of chemical compounds that were known to produce such effects, while the apparent reduction in heat output, despite normal fuel consumption, suggested that the combustion process itself was being modified by environmental factors that existed within the clearing, but which were not detectable through conventional observation methods. More significantly, the flames produced sounds that resembled human voices engaged in conversation or singing. Though no individual trapper could distinguish specific words or melodies that might have provided clues about the source or significance of these auditory phenomena. The psychological impact of these unusual fire characteristics was amplified by their effect on the normal social dynamics that characterized hunting camps, where evening gatherings around communal fires provided opportunities for sharing information about game sign, weather observations, and plans for subsequent days' hunting activities. The altered properties of their campfire seemed to inhibit normal conversation, while also creating an atmosphere of apprehension that made it difficult for the trappers to maintain the kind of relaxed camaraderie that was essential for maintaining morale during extended periods of isolation in wilderness conditions. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that several members of the hunting party had begun humming melodies that none of them could identify or remember learning. Their unconscious musical performances, apparently triggered by exposure to the acoustic phenomena associated with the modified campfire characteristics. When questioned about these songs, the trappers expressed confusion and concern about their inability to control vocalizations that seemed to emerge without conscious intention, while their attempts to reproduce the melodies deliberately resulted in failure and, in several cases, physical discomfort that included throat irritation and difficulty breathing. The tracking patterns that began to appear around the perimeter of the clearing during the first night provided concrete evidence that the camp was being observed by entities whose behavior suggested intelligence and purposeful activity rather than random animal movement or natural environmental processes. The footprints that encircled the campsite in concentric patterns showed characteristics that were inconsistent with known wildlife species, while also exhibiting spatial relationships that suggested coordinated group activity conducted according to systematic principles that implied planning and communication capabilities. Most significantly, the tracking pattern showed evidence of gradual encroachment toward the camp's interior, despite the apparent reluctance of whatever entities had created them to cross the boundary established by the campfire's illumination. This behavior suggested both curiosity about the trapper's presence and caution about approaching too closely to human activity, while also indicating that the entities responsible for the tracks possessed sufficient intelligence to recognize the campfire as a potential barrier or defensive mechanism that might pose threats to their safety or objectives. The trappers' attempts to identify the source of these tracks through conventional tracking methods proved frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful, as the footprints exhibited characteristics that seemed to shift between different patterns and sizes depending on observation angle and lighting conditions. Some appeared to be consistent with large predatory mammals, while others resembled human footprints that had been modified through disease, injury, or deliberate alteration. And still others showed features that could not be attributed to any known species of animal or human variation. The systematic nature of the encirclement pattern suggested that the entities creating the tracks possessed not only intelligence, but also social organization that enabled coordinated group activities conducted according to shared objectives and communication methods. The precision of the circular formation and the consistent distance maintained from the campfire indicated planning capabilities that exceeded simple animal behavior, while also demonstrating respect for or fear of the boundary established by human presence and fire-based defensive measures. The first manifestation of the forest's hunger came with the soft grey light of pre-dawn on November 3rd, when the trappers stirred from uneasy sleep to discover that 3 of their company had vanished during the night, without sound, struggle, or any indication of the circumstances that had led to their departure from bedrolls that remained undisturbed despite the absence of the men who should have occupied them until morning broke across the Transylvanian ridges. The missing hunters, Pavel Ionescu, a veteran tracker whose knowledge of Carpathian wildlife had made him invaluable during previous expeditions. Mihail Popescu, whose skill with rifle and snare had earned him recognition throughout Cluj County, and young Stefan Dumitrescu, barely 18 but already showing promise as a woodsman whose enthusiasm had impressed even the most experienced members of the party, had simply ceased to exist within the boundaries of the camp while leaving behind personal effects that suggested they had intended to return to their sleeping places before whatever force had claimed them had made such return impossible. The bedrolls themselves presented a puzzle that defied conventional explanation, their condition suggesting that the missing men had not departed voluntarily, but had instead been removed from their sleeping positions through methods that left no traces of struggle, resistance, or even normal movement that might have disturbed the careful arrangement of blankets and personal items that surrounded each sleeping area. The bedding remained precisely positioned as it would have appeared with sleeping occupants, creating depressions in the earth that corresponded to human body weight and shape, while personal possessions including hunting knives, tobacco pouches, and items of clothing had been left in positions that indicated their owners had expected to reclaim them after periods of rest that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their anticipation or control. More disturbing than the absence of the men themselves was the absence of footprints or other physical evidence that might have indicated the direction of their departure from the camp or the method by which they had been transported away from their sleeping positions. The soft earth surrounding each bedroll should have retained clear impressions of footsteps, drag marks, or other signs of movement. But the ground appeared undisturbed, except for the mysterious boot prints that continued to circle the camp's perimeter in patterns that seemed to grow more complex and more tightly focused with each passing hour, as if whatever entities were creating these tracks were gradually closing distance while maintaining respect for boundaries that they were not yet prepared to cross. The discovery of the first vanishing created an immediate crisis of leadership and morale among the remaining 24 trappers, whose confidence in their ability to understand and control their environment had been shaken by evidence that forces beyond their experience or knowledge were operating within the clearing according to principles that violated their assumptions about the relationship between human will and natural law. Gheorghe Moldovan's authority as expedition leader was challenged by hunters who questioned the wisdom of remaining in a location where men could disappear without warning. While his own conviction that practical explanations could be found for apparently supernatural phenomena was undermined by physical evidence that seemed to support the local folklore that he had dismissed as peasant superstition, unworthy of serious consideration by educated men. The systematic search of the forest surrounding the clearing that was conducted during the hours immediately following the discovery of the missing trappers yielded results that were both incomplete and disturbing, providing fragmentary evidence of human presence while failing to locate either the missing individuals or comprehensive explanations for their disappearance. The search parties that ventured into the woodland areas adjacent to the camp discovered articles of clothing and personal effects that appeared to belong to the vanished hunters. But these items were found in locations and conditions that raised more questions than they answered about the circumstances that had led to their owner's disappearance. Pavel Ionescu's hunting knife was discovered embedded in the trunk of an oak tree, approximately 200 meters from the camp. The blade driven so deeply into the hardwood that its removal required the combined efforts of 3 strong men using tools and techniques that would not have been available to someone working alone in darkness. The positioning of the knife and the force required for its placement suggested either superhuman strength or the use of mechanical devices that would have been impossible to transport and operate without creating noise that should have alerted other members of the camping party to unusual activities taking place in their vicinity. Mihail Popescu's tobacco pouch was found suspended from a tree branch at a height that could not have been reached by normal human climbing techniques, its position suggesting that it had been placed there by someone or something capable of ascending to positions that exceeded the capabilities of even the most skilled woodsman in the party. The pouch itself showed no signs of damage or disturbance, its contents remaining intact despite exposure to morning dew and wind conditions that should have affected loose materials, while its careful positioning seemed to indicate deliberate placement rather than accidental loss during struggle or hasty departure. Most mysteriously, Stefan Dumitrescu's leather cap was discovered in the exact center of the clearing, positioned precisely at the geometric midpoint of the circular space, where no vegetation grew and where the soil exhibited properties that differed from the surrounding forest floor. The cap had been arranged with the same careful attention to position and orientation that characterized the missing trapper's undisturbed bedrolls, suggesting that its placement was part of a larger pattern of activity that involved the systematic arrangement of objects according to principles that the remaining trappers could not understand, but which seemed to reflect intelligence and purposeful behavior. The condition of these recovered items provided additional evidence that the disappearances had occurred under circumstances that exceeded normal human experience, as each object showed signs of having been exposed to environmental conditions that could not be explained by the weather patterns and atmospheric phenomena that had characterized the night when the vanishings had occurred. The metal components of Pavel's knife showed corrosion patterns that would normally require months or years of exposure to develop, while the leather of Stefan's cap exhibited aging and weathering that seemed inconsistent with its known history and recent manufacture. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the personal effects had been arranged in positions that formed geometric patterns when viewed from elevated perspectives, their spatial relationships suggesting that the entities responsible for the trapper's disappearance possessed not only intelligence and organizational capabilities, but also aesthetic sensibilities that included appreciation for mathematical precision and visual symmetry. The overall configuration created by the positioned objects corresponded to traditional Romanian folk symbols that were associated with protection against evil influences, but the symbols had been inverted or modified in ways that seemed designed to produce opposite effects, transforming protective talismans into devices that might attract rather than repel supernatural attention. The psychological impact of these discoveries on the surviving members of the hunting party was intensified by changes in environmental conditions that seemed to accelerate during the daylight hours when normal forest activity should have provided reassurance about the natural character of their surroundings. The acoustic anomalies that had begun during their first night in the clearing became more pronounced and more clearly structured, evolving from random sounds that might have been attributed to wind or animal movement into organized patterns that resembled musical compositions or spoken communications conducted in languages that none of the trappers could identify, but which seemed familiar in ways that created deep unease about the source and purpose of these auditory phenomena. The watches and timepieces carried by various members of the party began to exhibit synchronization failures that created confusion about the actual passage of time and made it difficult to maintain coordination between different groups of hunters who were conducting search activities or guard duties according to schedules that no longer corresponded to reliable temporal measurements. Some timepieces advanced rapidly, while others stopped entirely, creating temporal discrepancies that made it impossible to establish accurate chronologies for events or to maintain effective communication between individuals whose activities needed to be coordinated according to precise timing relationships. More significantly, several of the trappers began to experience episodes during which they found themselves humming or singing melodies that they could not identify and could not remember learning. Their unconscious musical performances, apparently triggered by exposure to the acoustic phenomena that continued to emanate from sources within the forest that could not be located despite systematic attempts to triangulate the origins of these sounds. The songs themselves seemed to possess hypnotic qualities that made it difficult for the affected individuals to stop their vocalizations voluntarily, while their lyrics, when they could be distinguished, appeared to be in archaic forms of Romanian or other regional languages that incorporated references to practices and beliefs that predated Christian influence in Transylvania. The most disturbing aspect of these involuntary musical performances was their apparent contagious character, as exposure to one affected individual's singing seemed to trigger similar responses in other trappers who had not previously experienced such symptoms. The spread of this phenomenon created concern that whatever force was responsible for the missing hunter's disappearance was also capable of influencing the behavior and mental processes of the surviving members of the party through methods that operated below the level of conscious awareness, and which might eventually result in additional disappearances or other forms of control that could compromise the expedition's safety and success. The fire that had provided both practical illumination and psychological comfort during their first night in the clearing continued to exhibit the unusual characteristics that had initially caused concern. But these anomalies intensified during the second day in ways that made it increasingly difficult to maintain normal camping routines and social activities that depended on reliable heat and light sources. The flames maintained their blue coloration and reduced heat output, while also producing sounds that became more clearly recognizable as human voices engaged in conversations or songs that seemed to comment on the activities and discussions taking place around the campfire. Most disturbingly, several trappers reported that they could distinguish specific words and phrases within these vocal phenomena, including their own names and references to personal information that should not have been known to external observers. The voices seemed to be commenting on private thoughts and concerns that individuals had not shared with other members of the party, creating fears that their mental privacy was being violated by entities that possessed capabilities for accessing human consciousness through methods that exceeded normal sensory perception or conventional eavesdropping techniques. The systematic nature of these intrusions into personal mental space suggested that the entities responsible for the trapper's disappearance were not merely opportunistic predators taking advantage of vulnerable individuals, but were instead conducting organized intelligence-gathering activities designed to acquire information about human psychology, behavior patterns, and decision-making processes that might be useful for purposes that extended beyond simple elimination of intruders into territory that they considered their own domain. The terror that gripped the remaining 24 trappers following the discovery of their 3 missing companions drove them toward desperate measures that combined practical defense with ritualistic activities drawn from half-remembered folklore and superstitious practices that their rational minds normally would have dismissed as peasant ignorance unworthy of consideration by educated men, who prided themselves on scientific approaches to problem-solving. But the evidence of supernatural forces operating within the Hoia Baciu clearing had shattered their confidence in conventional understanding of natural law, creating psychological conditions where any action that promised protection or control seemed preferable to passive acceptance of circumstances that threatened to reduce their numbers through systematic elimination conducted according to principles they could neither understand nor predict. The decision to drive wooden stakes deep into the earth around their campsite reflected both military engineering concepts that several of the trappers had learned during army service and traditional Romanian practices that were designed to create barriers against evil influences that operated through spiritual rather than physical means. The stakes themselves were fashioned from oak branches that had been cut from trees growing outside the mysterious circular clearing, their selection based on folklore that attributed protective qualities to wood that had not been contaminated by contact with supernatural forces, while their placement followed patterns that combined geometric precision with symbolic arrangements that were intended to invoke divine protection against entities whose hostility toward human presence had been demonstrated through the systematic disappearance of expedition members. Gheorghe Moldovan supervised the stake-driving activities with the same attention to technical detail that had characterized his leadership of previous hunting expeditions. But his instructions reflected growing recognition that conventional wilderness survival techniques were inadequate for dealing with threats that operated according to supernatural rather than natural principles. The stakes were positioned to form multiple concentric circles around the central camping area, their spacing calculated to create overlapping zones of protection while also ensuring that the defensive perimeter could be monitored and maintained by the reduced number of guards, whose vigilance represented the expedition's primary defense against further nighttime disappearances. The depth to which each stake was driven into the earth exceeded what would have been necessary for ordinary camping purposes, reflecting both the trappers' determination to create permanent anchors that could not be easily disturbed by natural forces and their intuitive understanding that whatever entities were responsible for their companions' disappearance might possess capabilities for manipulating physical objects that exceeded normal human strength or conventional animal behavior. The process of driving the stakes required exhausting physical labor, conducted with tools that had been designed for hunting rather than construction activities. While the resistance encountered from the earth itself seemed unnaturally high, as if the soil was actively opposing their attempts to establish defensive barriers within the supernatural territory they had invaded. But perhaps most significantly, the work was accompanied by involuntary vocalizations that seemed to emerge from the trappers' throats without conscious intention, their voices producing sounds that resembled prayer, incantation, or ritual chanting, despite their lack of knowledge about the specific spiritual traditions from which these practices might have originated. The phenomenon created recognition that their exposure to the clearing's supernatural influences was affecting their behavior and mental processes in ways that exceeded simple fear response, suggesting that whatever forces controlled this territory were capable of accessing and modifying human consciousness through methods that operated below the level of rational awareness. The rope work that connected the driven stakes represented an attempt to create physical barriers that would supplement the spiritual protection that the wooden anchors were intended to provide. But the patterns and techniques employed in this construction reflected knowledge and skills that none of the trappers could remember learning through conventional means. The knots that secured the rope to each stake were complex configurations that resembled traditional Romanian folk designs associated with protection against supernatural influences, while the overall pattern created by the rope network corresponded to geometric arrangements that were used in rural communities for purposes related to blessing crops, protecting livestock, and ensuring favorable weather conditions. The rope itself had been sanctified through improvised rituals that combined Christian prayer with older practices that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the trappers' collective unconscious. Their activities guided by instinctive knowledge that appeared to derive from cultural memories that had been preserved across generations of Transylvanian residents who had faced similar threats in times and places where formal religious authority had provided inadequate protection against supernatural predation. The sanctification process involved the application of substances that included tobacco, salt, and small amounts of blood that had been drawn from volunteers who understood that such offerings might be necessary for ensuring the effectiveness of protective measures that operated through spiritual rather than purely physical mechanisms. The distribution of tobacco around the perimeter of their defensive installation reflected both practical considerations related to masking human scent that might attract hostile attention and ritual purposes that drew upon traditional Romanian folk magic practices that employed aromatic substances for creating barriers against evil influences. The tobacco was scattered according to patterns that emphasized the cardinal directions, while also creating spiral configurations that were intended to confuse or disorient entities that might attempt to breach the defensive perimeter through systematic probing for weaknesses in the protective barriers that the trappers had established around their increasingly precarious sanctuary. But the tobacco also served as an offering to whatever supernatural forces controlled the clearing, representing attempts to establish diplomatic relationships that might reduce hostility through acknowledgement of territorial rights and demonstrations of respect for entities whose power exceeded human understanding. The quantities of tobacco employed for this purpose represented substantial portions of the trappers' personal supplies, indicating their growing recognition that conventional resources might need to be sacrificed in exchange for supernatural protection that could ensure survival during the remaining duration of their stay in territory that had proven hostile to human presence. The burning of tobacco as sacrificial offerings created atmospheric effects that seemed to influence the behavior of the mysterious entities whose presence had been indicated by the circling footprint patterns that continued to surround the camp. With modifications in track frequency and positioning that suggested the offerings were being acknowledged and evaluated according to criteria that remained incomprehensible to human observers. The reduction in apparent surveillance activity during periods when tobacco smoke was most concentrated indicated that these substances might indeed provide temporary protection, while the resumption of tracking patterns when the offerings were consumed suggested that any safety achieved through such means would be temporary and would require continuous renewal through additional sacrificial activities. The construction of prayer knots represented the most explicitly religious dimension of the trappers' defensive preparations, combining Christian symbolism with older spiritual practices that reflected the syncretic character of Romanian folk religion that had evolved through centuries of interaction between formal church doctrine and traditional beliefs that preserved elements of pre-Christian spiritual systems. The knots themselves were tied according to patterns that incorporated specific numbers and configurations that were associated with divine protection, while their placement throughout the rope network created focal points for spiritual energy that were intended to strengthen the overall effectiveness of the defensive barriers that surrounded their endangered camp. The creation of these prayer knots was accompanied by recitation of formal prayers, along with improvised appeals for protection that seemed to draw upon spiritual knowledge that exceeded the trappers' conscious understanding of religious doctrine or traditional practices. The words that emerged from their lips during these activities often incorporated archaic language forms and references to spiritual entities that were not part of conventional Christian theology, suggesting that their exposure to the clearing's supernatural influences was awakening cultural memories that had been suppressed or forgotten during processes of religious conversion and modernization that had affected rural Transylvanian communities across previous generations. But despite the psychological comfort provided by these ritualistic activities and the apparent temporary effectiveness of some protective measures, the systematic disappearance of additional expedition members continued with relentless precision that seemed to mock their efforts to establish control over circumstances that exceeded human understanding and authority. The second night in the clearing witnessed the vanishing of 4 more trappers, whose absence was discovered at dawn, despite the enhanced vigilance and defensive preparations that had been implemented following the previous day's losses. The missing individuals, Vasile Cristea, an experienced hunter whose knowledge of traditional woodcraft had made him one of the expedition's most valuable members. Ion Marinescu, whose skill with firearms had provided security for previous hunting parties operating in dangerous territory. Dumitru Nistor, whose familiarity with local folklore might have provided insights into the supernatural forces they were confronting. And Florin Dascălu, whose youth and physical strength had made him valuable for the heavy labor required for establishing and maintaining camp facilities, had disappeared according to the same mysterious pattern that had characterized the previous vanishings, their bedrolls remaining undisturbed, while their personal effects suggested they had intended to return after brief absences that had somehow become permanent departures from the world of the living. The failure of their defensive measures to prevent these additional disappearances created despair and panic among the remaining 20 trappers, whose confidence in their ability to survive their remaining time in the clearing had been further undermined by evidence that supernatural forces were capable of penetrating protective barriers that had been constructed according to both rational engineering principles and traditional spiritual practices. The realization that conventional human knowledge and capabilities were inadequate for defending against entities that operated according to principles that exceeded natural law created psychological conditions where individual survival instincts began to override group loyalty and cooperative decision-making processes that were essential for maintaining expedition discipline and effectiveness. The desperation that consumed the remaining 20 trappers following the second night's additional losses drove them toward measures that exceeded even their previous attempts to establish protective barriers against the supernatural forces that were systematically reducing their numbers according to principles that seemed to mock human understanding of cause and effect. The construction that began at dawn on November 5th represented not merely another defensive strategy, but a fundamental transformation in their approach to survival. Abandoning conventional wilderness tactics in favor of ritualistic activities that drew upon collective unconscious knowledge of practices that their rational minds could not identify, but which emerged from cultural memories that had been awakened by their prolonged exposure to forces that operated beyond the boundaries of natural law. The crown of stakes that began to take shape at the precise geometric center of the circular clearing represented the culmination of desperate ingenuity combined with involuntary spiritual knowledge that seemed to flow through the surviving trappers like water through a broken dam, their hands working according to patterns and techniques that none could remember learning, but which felt as familiar as breathing, despite their obvious complexity and symbolic significance. The structure itself violated conventional principles of carpentry and engineering, while simultaneously embodying mathematical relationships and aesthetic harmonies that created recognition among even the most skeptical observers that they were participating in activities that transcended ordinary human construction and entered territories where craft became sacrament. The timber selected for this desperate construction project had been gathered from specific locations throughout the forest that the trappers could not consciously identify, but toward which they felt compelled to travel despite the obvious dangers posed by venturing beyond the relative safety of their established camp. Each piece of wood had been chosen according to criteria that combined practical considerations related to structural integrity with spiritual requirements that remained mysterious even to the individuals who applied these standards with automatic certainty that suggested knowledge acquired through means other than conventional learning processes. The oak branches that formed the crown's primary framework had been harvested from trees that exhibited unusual growth patterns, their bark bearing marks that resembled script in languages that none of the trappers could read, but which seemed to communicate information about the forest's history and the fate of previous human visitors who had challenged its territorial boundaries. The harvesting process itself had required rituals that combined Christian prayers with older incantations that emerged spontaneously from throats that had never before produced such sounds, creating acoustic phenomena that seemed to resonate with the supernatural forces that controlled the clearing, while also establishing communication channels through which human intentions could be transmitted to entities whose cooperation might be essential for survival. The binding techniques employed to connect the various wooden elements into a unified structure reflected knowledge of traditional Romanian ropework that had been developed across generations of craftsmen whose skills had been refined through practical applications that included not only mundane construction projects, but also specialized activities related to spiritual protection and supernatural communication. The knots themselves incorporated patterns that served both functional and symbolic purposes, their geometric arrangements creating mathematical relationships that corresponded to harmonic proportions found in folk music, architectural design, and religious iconography throughout Eastern European cultural traditions. But perhaps most significantly, the binding process required materials that had been consecrated through sacrificial offerings that represented the trappers' willingness to surrender personal possessions and even portions of their own bodies in exchange for spiritual protection that might prove more effective than the physical barriers that had already failed to prevent their companions' mysterious disappearances. The rope had been soaked in blood that had been voluntarily donated by each surviving member of the expedition, creating both practical lubrication that facilitated the binding process and spiritual connections that linked individual fates to the collective enterprise that represented their final attempt to establish control over circumstances that exceeded their understanding. The crown's construction proceeded according to a systematic plan that seemed to emerge organically from the trappers' collective unconscious, rather than being developed through conscious deliberation or consultation of written sources that might have provided guidance for such ambitious undertakings. The structure grew through accretion of individual components whose placement was determined through intuitive processes that reflected each worker's understanding of his role within a larger pattern that would achieve completion only when all participants had contributed their specialized knowledge and labor to activities that transcended individual capabilities while creating results that exceeded the sum of individual contributions. The vertical posts that formed the crown's supporting structure were positioned according to astronomical alignments that corresponded to celestial phenomena that were occurring during the specific time period when construction activities were being conducted. creating connections between earthly defensive measures and cosmic forces whose influence might provide protection against supernatural predators that operated according to spiritual rather than physical principles. The trappers' knowledge of these astronomical relationships seemed to emerge spontaneously during the construction process. Their understanding of stellar positions and planetary movements exceeding what could have been acquired through casual observation or conventional education. The horizontal connecting elements that linked the vertical posts into a unified framework incorporated measurements and proportional relationships that reflected traditional Romanian folk architecture, while also embodying symbolic meanings that were associated with protection against evil influences and communication with beneficial spiritual entities whose cooperation might be essential for ensuring human survival in territories where natural law had been modified or suspended through supernatural intervention. These measurements were applied using improvised tools whose construction required additional knowledge that seemed to flow through the workers' hands without conscious learning or deliberate instruction. The weaving patterns that created the crown's interior surfaces reflected textile traditions that had been preserved across generations of rural Romanian women whose skills in fabric creation had served both practical and spiritual functions, providing not only clothing and household goods, but also protective talismans and ceremonial objects that were employed in rituals designed to ensure family safety and community prosperity. The adaptation of these patterns to wood construction required improvisations that combined traditional knowledge with innovative techniques that emerged spontaneously from the trappers' growing understanding of the relationship between physical construction and spiritual protection. The completion of the crown's basic structure was marked by atmospheric changes that seemed to indicate acknowledgement from the supernatural forces that controlled the clearing, with modifications in wind patterns, temperature, and acoustic phenomena that suggested the defensive installation was being evaluated according to criteria that remained incomprehensible to human observers, but which appeared to involve approval or rejection based on standards that related to both technical competence and spiritual authenticity. But perhaps most significantly, the crown's completion seemed to create stabilization in the mysterious phenomena that had been affecting the trappers' timepieces and navigation instruments, suggesting that the structure was indeed providing some form of protection against forces that had been disrupting normal physical laws within the clearing's boundaries. The watches that had been spinning randomly or stopping entirely began to maintain consistent time, while compass needles resumed normal behavior patterns that enabled accurate determination of cardinal directions and navigation planning for potential evacuation activities. The ledger that documented the crown's construction provided written evidence of the systematic planning and spiritual preparation that had guided this desperate undertaking. But the journal entries themselves exhibited characteristics that challenged conventional understanding of authorship and textual composition. Multiple handwriting styles appeared throughout the document, despite being written by individuals whose normal penmanship had been consistent throughout previous portions of the expedition's record-keeping, suggesting that the writers were being influenced by external forces that were modifying their normal behavioral patterns and cognitive processes. More disturbing was the discovery that portions of the ledger contained information that none of the surviving trappers could remember writing, including technical specifications for construction techniques that exceeded their conscious knowledge and spiritual formulas that employed languages and symbolic systems that they could not identify, despite having apparently transcribed these materials with careful attention to accuracy and detail. These mysterious entries suggested that the crown's construction had involved collaboration with entities whose knowledge exceeded human understanding, but whose cooperation was being provided through channels that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The final entries in the ledger documented growing recognition among the surviving trappers that their defensive measures, while possibly providing temporary protection, were not intended to ensure permanent safety, but rather to create conditions that would enable escape from territory where human presence was not welcome, and where continued occupation would eventually result in systematic elimination, regardless of whatever protective measures might be implemented. The crown was designed not as a fortress, but as an anchor that would prevent the complete dissolution of reality that seemed to threaten individuals who remained too long within the clearing's supernatural influence. The gendarmes, who arrived at the Hoia Baciu clearing on November 12, 1883, found evidence of a catastrophe that challenged every principle of criminal investigation and natural disaster assessment that had been developed through decades of professional experience in dealing with missing persons, wilderness accidents, and the various tragedies that could befall groups of individuals who ventured into remote territories where rescue operations were complicated by difficult terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. Captain Alexandru Popescu, whose reputation for methodical investigation techniques had earned him respect throughout the Cluj district, approached the scene with expectations based on conventional patterns of camp abandonment, wildlife attacks, or weather emergencies that typically explained the disappearance of hunting parties whose planned expeditions had ended in tragedy rather than successful return with game and pelts. But the physical evidence that greeted the official investigation defied categorization according to any framework that Captain Popescu had encountered during his 15 years of law enforcement service in Transylvania's rural regions, where his duties had included response to incidents ranging from bandit attacks on merchant caravans to avalanches that had claimed entire villages during severe winter storms. The campsite that should have contained either clear evidence of violence or systematic abandonment instead presented a tableau that seemed to exist in multiple contradictory states simultaneously, with material objects that appeared both present and absent, normal and impossible, according to observation angles and lighting conditions that changed the apparent nature of reality itself. The tents that had housed 27 trappers during their brief and fatal occupation of the clearing stood in positions that corresponded to military precision, while simultaneously appearing to collapse inward, according to physics that operated according to principles that exceeded natural law. From certain viewing angles, the canvas structures seemed intact and properly configured, their guy lines taut, and their stakes securely anchored in earth that showed no signs of disturbance or weather damage. But movement of only a few meters revealed complete structural failure, with fabric that had deflated like punctured balloons and support systems that had somehow been removed without leaving traces of the hardware that should have remained embedded in the ground where the original installation had been completed. The venison that had been preserved according to traditional smoking techniques employed by experienced hunters whose skills had been refined across generations of wilderness survival presented perhaps the most disturbing evidence of the supernatural forces that had transformed the hunting camp from functional base of operations into monument to inexplicable tragedy. The meat that should have remained flexible and edible despite exposure to autumn weather conditions had been transformed into sheets of material that exhibited the hardness and brittleness of iron while maintaining surface appearances that suggested normal preservation processes had been conducted according to conventional methods and timing schedules. More significantly, the preserved meat had been arranged in patterns that corresponded to geometric configurations rather than practical storage systems, with individual pieces positioned according to mathematical relationships that created overall designs resembling traditional Romanian folk symbols that were associated with death, transformation, and communication between the world of the living and spiritual realms, where the dead continued to exist according to modified forms of consciousness that retained connections to earthly concerns, while operating according to principles that transcended normal human understanding of identity and individual survival. The pocket watches that were discovered scattered throughout the campsite in crescent formations provided the most concrete evidence that the trappers' disappearance had involved temporal anomalies that exceeded conventional understanding of time measurement and chronological sequence. Each timepiece had stopped at the same impossible hour, a reading that corresponded to no actual time according to either 12-hour or 24-hour systems, while their internal mechanisms showed modifications that could not be attributed to normal wear, damage, or manufacturing defects that might have affected accuracy or operational reliability. The watch faces themselves had been altered through processes that seemed to combine extreme heat application with precision engraving techniques that had created new numerical arrangements and symbolic markings that incorporated traditional Romanian motifs, along with designs that appeared to represent astronomical phenomena or mathematical relationships that exceeded the educational background of rural trappers whose formal learning had been limited to practical skills required for wilderness survival and agricultural activities. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the watches continued to emit sound despite their apparent mechanical failure, their ticking creating rhythmic patterns that corresponded to human heartbeat rates, while also producing harmonic relationships that seemed designed to induce hypnotic states or altered consciousness in listeners who were exposed to their influence for extended periods. The gendarmes who conducted the initial investigation reported difficulty maintaining normal attention and decision-making capabilities while working in proximity to these devices, creating recognition that the supernatural forces responsible for the trappers' disappearance had created ongoing hazards that could affect subsequent visitors to the clearing. The absence of human remains, despite clear evidence that 27 individuals had occupied the campsite, created investigative challenges that exceeded Captain Popescu's training and experience, while also raising legal questions about how to document and classify incidents that involved disappearances without corresponding evidence of death, departure, or criminal activity that might have been conducted according to conventional methods and motivations. The systematic removal of human presence while leaving personal effects undisturbed suggested capabilities and objectives that were not consistent with ordinary criminal behavior, wildlife predation, or environmental disasters that typically explained missing person cases in rural areas. The bedrolls that remained, arranged in precise formations throughout the campsite, provided the most haunting evidence of the trappers' fate, their configuration suggesting that the missing individuals had been removed from their sleeping positions through methods that left physical imprints that corresponded to human body shapes, while creating impressions that seemed to have been preserved through processes that exceeded normal soil mechanics and environmental conditions. The depressions in the earth retained details that included not only overall body outlines, but also specific features that corresponded to individual physical characteristics, creating recognition that the ground itself had somehow recorded and preserved information about each missing person's appearance and identity. Most disturbingly, several of these body impressions showed modifications that suggested the missing individuals had undergone physical transformations during the process of their disappearance, with outline shapes that exhibited anatomical features that exceeded normal human proportions, while maintaining recognizable relationships to baseline human morphology. These changes appeared to represent elongation of limbs, expansion of torso dimensions, and modification of head shapes that could not be attributed to decomposition processes or environmental factors that might have affected preserved remains under normal circumstances. The gloves that were discovered scattered throughout the campsite had been inverted in ways that suggested violent removal from human hands. But their condition indicated that this process had been accomplished without corresponding damage to the leather materials that should have shown tears, cuts, or other signs of forceful handling. The inversion patterns created by the gloves corresponded to geometric arrangements that seemed designed to communicate information about the fate of their former owners, while also serving as warnings to subsequent visitors who might be tempted to establish similar camps within territory that was controlled by forces that did not welcome human presence. The ledger that documented the trappers' activities and observations during their stay in the clearing provided written evidence of the systematic deterioration of normal human consciousness and behavior that had preceded their final disappearance. But the journal entries exhibited characteristics that challenged conventional understanding of individual authorship and textual composition. The handwriting styles changed throughout the document, in ways that suggested multiple authors, despite being produced by the same physical hand, while the language itself evolved from standard Romanian through archaic dialectical forms towards symbols and notation systems that appeared to represent communication methods that preceded written language development. The final entry in the ledger had been terminated mid-sentence, with a word that appeared to have been interrupted not by conscious decision or external distraction, but by some form of intervention that had prevented completion of the thought that was being recorded. The incomplete word itself defied linguistic analysis, as its partial spelling could be interpreted as the beginning of multiple different terms in several languages, while also corresponding to sound patterns that seemed to represent non-human vocalizations or mechanical noises that might have been produced by devices whose operation was not consistent with 19th century technology. The crown of stakes that occupied the geometric center of the clearing provided the most concrete evidence of the trappers' desperate attempts to establish control over supernatural forces that exceeded their understanding and capabilities. But the structure itself exhibited properties that suggested it had been completed through collaboration between human intelligence and entities whose knowledge and abilities transcended normal limitations of individual or group construction projects. The precision of the measurements, the complexity of the joining techniques, and the sophisticated understanding of both engineering principles and spiritual symbolism that the structure embodied exceeded what could have been accomplished by 27 hunters whose backgrounds and education had not prepared them for such ambitious undertakings. The ropework that bound the various wooden elements into unified structural configurations incorporated patterns and techniques that represented synthesis of multiple cultural traditions, combining Romanian folkcraft methods with influences that appeared to derive from Germanic, Hungarian, and other regional sources, while also embodying innovations that seemed to emerge from direct communication with supernatural entities whose cooperation had been essential for achieving the level of technical sophistication that the completed structure represented. But perhaps most significantly, the crown continued to function as intended despite the disappearance of its human creators, maintaining stability and structural integrity, while also producing environmental effects that seemed designed to preserve evidence of the camping expedition, while preventing unauthorized access by individuals who lacked proper spiritual preparation or understanding of the risks involved in exposure to forces that operated beyond the boundaries of natural law. The 9 survivors who were discovered wandering along the forest paths that led from the Hoia Baciu clearing back toward the civilization of Cluj presented physical and psychological evidence of experiences that exceeded normal human endurance, while challenging medical and psychiatric understanding of the relationship between traumatic exposure and subsequent behavioral modifications. The men who had once been skilled hunters and experienced woodsmen had been transformed into hollow-eyed wanderers whose capacity for normal human communication had been severely compromised by prolonged exposure to supernatural influences that had modified their consciousness while leaving their physical bodies intact, but profoundly altered. Their tongues, blackened with soil that appeared to have been consumed rather than accidentally ingested, bore evidence of dietary practices that were inconsistent with normal human nutrition, while suggesting participation in ritualistic activities that involved the consumption of earth from the supernatural clearing where their companions had vanished. The soil itself showed properties that differed from normal earth composition, containing mineral elements and organic compounds that could not be identified through conventional analysis, while exhibiting characteristics that suggested it had been modified through processes that combined chemical transformation with spiritual influences. The single phrase that these survivors repeated with mechanical persistence, "the circle," provided the only verbal communication that they were capable of producing, despite intensive questioning by medical professionals, religious authorities, and criminal investigators whose attempts to extract additional information about their experiences had proven completely unsuccessful. The manner of their pronunciation suggested that the words carried meanings that exceeded their normal linguistic definition, while also indicating that their repetition served functions related to psychological survival rather than simple communication of factual information about events that had occurred during their stay in the clearing. The medical examinations conducted by Cluj's most experienced physicians revealed physical modifications that could not be attributed to normal environmental exposure, malnutrition, or psychological trauma that typically affected individuals who had survived wilderness emergencies or criminal attacks. Their nervous systems showed adaptations that suggested prolonged exposure to electromagnetic influences, while their sensory organs exhibited modifications that seemed designed to enhance perception of phenomena that existed beyond normal human detection ranges.